Good afternoon. Welcome to APA's 7th Town Hall on COVID-19. My name is Billy Zadig, APA Standards and Codes Administrator. Allow me to review a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. All attendees are in listen-only mode, and we ask that you utilize the chat box for the Q&A segment of this session. While we attempt to respond to all questions submitted, should we run out of time, responses will be posted to APA's COVID-19 RAQ, Recently Asked Questions webpage. We also remind participants to ensure their speaker volume levels are set to your comfort. Our speakers are gathering us from across the continent, and as such, varying volumes will be present. Today's session will be awarded professional continuing education credits, as well as ISDs and AIA CLUs. For AIA certificates, please email me at Billie, B-I-L-L-I-E, @APA.org, along with your AIA membership number. Our webinar recordings will be posted to APA's website later this afternoon. Additionally, you will receive a follow-up email within 72 hours providing designated links to our webinar recordings, as well as information on upcoming webinars and town halls. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Lander Medlin, APA's Executive Vice President, your moderator for today. Lander, take it away.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Billy. We appreciate your engagement in these town hall meetings as we further explore the impact of COVID-19 on our facilities organizations. I'd like to thank both our regular participants, I see some regulars, and any new folks who decided to join us today. Our prior town halls have been recorded along with answers to all, and I mean all, your questions, and posted to the APA COVID-19 website resource center. It is constantly being updated, so please return regularly. And our town hall meetings do occur every Friday at this time with a different target and focus. Hint, next week's is If, Then, What scenarios. Again, thanks for joining the dialogue. We really want your questions. That's what makes this a rich conversation and the special community we share. So post them at any time. We are pleased that we have the opportunity for this town hall to collaborate with Gordian, formerly Sightlines. Gordian helps higher education institutions effectively plan, build, and manage their physical campus to ensure optimal stewardship at every phase of the building life cycle. I want to personally thank Pete Zurok for his thoughtful assistance in planning for this town hall on space. In my Monday morning message this past week, I said, the next unimaginable nightmare lurks around the corner. The impact of the larger economies are roiling higher education. The challenges are financial, they are real, and they are upon us as we look to this coming academic year and well into the future. That's why we chose this topic today. The impact of COVID-19 on space, a very new frontier for sure. Along with these four panelists, they will help us progress the conversation to the broader issues around how the current response and its resulting financial impacts are driving us to rethink space needs. So here's the format for today's town hall. I'll provide an introduction to set the context, provide preliminary results on our latest space survey using an infographic, set the stage for this changing playing field we call space, introduce our stellar panel who will provide some opening or framing remarks, and then we'll get right to the Q&A. As I know you've got many questions to ask this exceptional panel, I'll conclude with a call for images, available resources, a save the date, and closing remarks. As you will recall, if you joined us in the past, I've opened each town hall with a compare and contrast of the coronavirus statistics. Yesterday, April 30, 2020, the U.S. crested 1 million coronavirus cases and 63,000 deaths. Just 5 weeks ago, we were at 85,500 cases and 1,300 deaths. Unless I say on March 5, a little over 2 months ago, we were only at 200 cases and 0 deaths. We are still far from the end of the effects of the coronavirus spread, yet several states are reopening their economy. Good decision? Or essentially launching an experiment in human sacrifice? The jury is out. In fact, no state has met the federal guidelines for reopening, and those guidelines expired last night. Definitely splintered strategies to reopening state by state. The good news is a few states look as though they have peaked. Lest I say it for the 100th time, the exponential rate and pace associated with this virus remain. Time to think differently in terms of options, probabilities, and possibilities. This is critical for our institutional response to a recovery and reopening. And as you will hear today, the changes to our industry are also occurring at an exponential rate and pace. Let's look at a few other numbers that will provide the context for our panel's discussion today. Stay at home or shelter at home orders are either being lifted or relaxed. It's like cognitive dissonance. Some are taking victory laps while others are bracing for the worst yet to come, especially without significant testing, tracing, and treatment. Suffice it to say, we cannot get complacent with respect to social physical distancing to break the transmission. We know that works. Let's commit to it on our campuses in support of our communities and our essential frontline workers. Again, use your head. Stop the spread. The impact on the economy is beyond staggering. Yes, we hit another historic milestone yesterday, cresting 30 million people who have applied for unemployment benefits. That's an 18% of the US workforce, and it was just 4% 2 months ago. Another example of exponential change. Consumer spending fell 7.5% in March, the steepest monthly decline in records tracing back to 1959. Household incomes fell 2%. Cratering state tax revenues are leading to drastic cuts by June. Every financial indicator is being shattered. And the humanitarian food crisis worsens. These are daunting financial challenges in and of themselves. Add declining enrollments, loss of international students, a COVID-19 attitude shift by students and parents to local or regional institutions, the changing perspective of technology, to online learning, to an already overbuilt, underfunded physical infrastructure. And oh yes, a heavy dose of uncertainty. Whether your institution chooses to close, stay online, slow transition, hybrid approach, full reopen, you need to prepare now for how facilities can and will respond. Do we even know what the questions are? And there's no one-size-fits-all solution. So as a start, APA launched a new survey this past Tuesday on space considerations before, during, and after COVID-19. The following infographic provides a preliminary, and I mean preliminary, snapshot of 350 responses to date. Let's take a look. On the first left-hand bubble, there are future specific space plan commitments question. It's predominantly answered yes at 63%. And if yes, we asked how was it altered or impacted? Budget uncertainties, construction slowed, stopped, rethinking design standards to accomplish or accommodate social physical distancing. And you'll hear that from our panel. Adequate resources, 50-50. COVID choices aligned, you said yes. For future space utilization demand, most said increasing or decreasing, with the drivers as density reduced due to social physical density and consolidations, enrollment declines, and much more. And then future drivers have changed. Clearly, funding was number one, followed by program demands. And then is the campus today adequate to educate future students? You said yes. Flexible, or yes than not, and that's a good thing. And remember, these are still preliminary results, since we will not close the survey until this coming Monday at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. So get in your responses. We'd love to hear them. Finally, the old adage, build it and they will come, is ancient history. In this age of exponential change, the accelerant is the coronavirus, and it's one of nasty, destructive proportions. The unimaginable is here. Are you ready? Are you planning for every eventuality? Not just putting out the fire, but rebuilding the house differently at the same time. Hence our panel today, each speaking to this shifting landscape, providing possibilities and opportunities to the fluidity that is COVID-19. Let's start first with Peter Reeves. He's the Vice President for Member Services at Gordian. And at Gordian, formerly Sightlines, Peter handles both the day-to-day operation of his department with a focus on delivering facilities planning solutions across all of Gordian's markets. Peter has led consulting engagements with facilities and financial professionals within higher education and healthcare realms. He earned his BA in mathematics from Franklin and Marshall College. Peter will frame space pre and post COVID by addressing our unstable built environments foundation, the overbuilding and underinvesting, not aligning with strategic direction, too little revenue for too much real estate. They provide strategies, critical questions we should be asking in the immediate, midterm, and long term. You will find a number of tabletop questions throughout his presentation. Let's listen up to what Peter has to tell us. Peter?
Great. Thank you, Lander, and thank you, APA, for the invitation to be a part of this panel. I also want to thank everyone for their attendance today. I think we all certainly know that there are many pressing matters that you're all having to manage and deal with to serve your campus community, and so we appreciate you being here this afternoon. For a town hall that's focused on the impacts of COVID, I think you're going to hear me talk a lot about the state of higher education campuses before COVID. And I think you'll hear me talk a lot about what I think are very likely persistent issues that will continue to exist once we emerge on the other side of really the acute challenges that we're dealing with now and will be dealing with in the near term. This is not because I don't appreciate the significant impacts and the decisions that all of higher ed is needing to make in the immediate term to respond to COVID. It's not to say that COVID and the probable economic recession hasn't significantly impaired financial positions across many campuses. And it's not to say that the world after COVID might see significant changes in student preferences. Those may be in the form of what types of schools people are choosing to attend, how far they're willing to travel to go to school, or their possible increasing comfort with online learning. But what it is to say is that while these issues are severe and quite dramatic right now, these are really waves on a greater tide of change that we have seen facing higher education in the past and will continue to see facing higher education over the next 10 years. Issues such as the expansion of campus footprints that we've all witnessed over the last 10 years and the fixed costs associated with those footprints, stagnant enrollments facing the average campus, and in particular declining enrollments facing small private and regional public campuses nationwide, the reduced access to funding to support campuses, ranging from the withdrawal of state funding to the increasingly limited ability of campuses to take on debt. These trends were all in place prior to COVID, and we're going to radically alter the landscape of higher education. The question was always one of timing. The knock-on effects of COVID, in our mind, is that this will almost certainly accelerate the timing of these trends, and it will force many institutions to confront these structural challenges on a much faster timeline than maybe initially planned. The good news is that every crisis does provide an opportunity and present an opportunity. And in particular, opportunities to tackle what are often politically challenging decisions that are otherwise untouchable in calmer times. Understanding the structural challenges facing the industry that existed before the current crisis emerged, and anticipating what successful colleges and universities will look like 5 to 10 years from now can be our guide in decision-making in the heat of the current crisis. As campuses are able to align decisions made today in response to COVID with bolder strategies that will position their institution for long-term success, will ultimately be what differentiates the campuses that emerge from the current situation better than before from those that might not emerge at all. So now, with that little preamble, I'll speak specifically to the topic at hand today, which is this idea of how our campus is going to rethink space. Before we get into some of the trends that have gotten us to where we are today, I'd like to provide a simple framework that we think is useful in considerations when making decisions around the physical assets that your campus has. First, and what I imagine many of you are working hard to explain to your institutional leadership just now, is that whether a campus is full, half full, or empty, the fixed costs associated with each space on your campus are significant, and as I'll show in a few slides, will continue to increase over time. Second, we know that each space and the programs within those spaces on our campus provide some benefit back to the university. Often this is in the form of revenue from tuition or research grants, but it can also take less tangible forms, such as prestige, community goodwill, etc. Ultimately, as we're all being challenged and forced to make decisions around our space, we must compare the significant and increasing fixed costs of those spaces with the actual benefit back to the institution that that space provides. And at the end of the day, right or wrong, good or bad, prestige and community goodwill rarely replaces the roof. And so in times of economic challenge, these decisions must place an emphasis on the financial contributions coming from those spaces in order to make effective decisions about how to steward campus space over the long term. So what I'd like to do now is get into a handful of charts and trends that we've seen across higher education that really represent the long-standing structural trends that have existed in higher ed that will persist through the COVID crisis and on the other side. So on the next slide, we'll start by looking at how campuses have grown over the last 12 years. What we look at here is for the average campus, the growth in space, growth in campus footprint in the bars of 15% over the last 12 years, compared to the growth in enrollment, which is represented by the line of only 9% since 2007. Simply stated, what this chart says is that campuses have been increasing the fixed costs associated with their space over the last 12 years while not increasing their tuition revenue commensurately. Ultimately, this means that the average campus has fewer resources to maintain a larger footprint than they did 12 years ago. Now, if we move on and look at patterns in construction on the next slide, for a longer term horizon, what we can see is that across the higher education database as a whole, we've seen two distinct waves of construction over the last 150 years. As we all know, the first wave, ranging from about 1950 to 1980, represented an unprecedented increase in enrollment that commanded a dramatic expansion in the facilities to serve those students. What we have seen, and what was illustrated on the previous slide, is a second wave of construction has occurred over the last 20 or so years. And this wave of construction was largely driven by the expansion of new and more sophisticated programs, as well as the addition of student amenities. So while we understand what the drivers of these waves of construction have been across higher education, more importantly, this also helps us paint a picture of what our future holds with respect to building renewal costs. So if we were to overlay the typical building renewal life cycles of typical building systems for both these waves of construction, what we find is that within the next 15 years, higher ed as an industry will experience an overlapping of capital needs within these two waves of construction. What that ultimately means is that in the next 15 years, there will be a significant increase in the capital investment required just to maintain the current campus profiles that every institution has. On the next slide, we translate this waves of construction to actual, what is the annual capital dollars needed to keep up with buildings as they age. This looks historically and then also projects that going forward. When we look at this and identify where we are today, what this chart really highlights in very clear terms is that we are on an increasing curve for capital needs, and that is going to continue to increase to a level that's almost 40% higher than what we've experienced in the recent past over the next 10 years. What I think most of us know and have experiences over the last 10 years when we consider the capital needs that we've had to fund, which compared to the future are comparatively modest, according to this chart, we've been struggling to keep up with those investment levels. And ultimately what we've seen across higher education as a whole is that backlogs of building renewal and deferred maintenance have continued to grow. And in some cases, those backlogs have grown dramatically. As we look forward, what this highlights is that without increases in funding, or maybe more importantly, reduction in the overall capital needs by other means, such as divestment of space, this trend of increasing backlog is forecasted to accelerate and accelerate significantly in the future, with implications for the quality, the function of space, and the impact on programs. So what we've painted is a picture here of the needs of our space, of the campuses that we've built, and the needs within those buildings increasing, and needing an increase in resources to fund that space. So then the trends around resource levels are the next two that we want to focus on. So if we look at the next slide, what we wanted to think about is what we've seen as sort of the current funding picture across higher education. We all know that really incremental funding has been reduced over the last 10 years for pretty much most of higher education. In 2017, state funding for higher education was down across all but 8 states for the last 10 years. And within that, the average reduction in state support has been approximately 10%. Additionally, over a similar time frame, we've seen institutions increasingly look to use debt to finance their initiatives. And when we look forward, the capacity to continue to expand debt certainly could be called into question, as we've all heard from the outlook on higher education by various rating agencies. Now, under these circumstances, many institutions call for enrollment gains as a source of incremental revenue in the future, increasing the number of students on campus, increasing the tuition associated with that. However, on the next slide, as we transition and look at demographics, the left-hand chart shows that birth rates predict that the pool of traditional students will start to decline within the next 5 years, and that decline will continue for the following decade plus. Also, when asked if institutions' plans will look to increase enrollment in the near future as part of their strategic plan, 80% of campuses responded with a yes. With so many colleges and universities looking to increase enrollment in the near future, competition for each incremental student is going to be fierce. What that ultimately will mean is the cost to acquire each incremental student is going to be higher on the admissions and recruitment side, and it's likely going to result in lower net tuition rates for those students as competition is higher. So ultimately, when we look at it, with a declining pool of traditional students and increasing competition, the average institution is going to be increasingly challenged to differentiate themselves just to maintain their current enrollment levels, let alone drive incremental revenue from enrollment gains. So ultimately, we're in a position where we have institutions that have built a campus that has a significant fixed cost into an environment where the sources of revenue to maintain that have been declining, and that decline in those sources of funding looks to accelerate into the future. So on the final slide, just to come back to the concept that we started with, we highlighted the growth in space versus enrollment, but by different constituent groups, looking at baccalaureate on the left, master's universities in the middle, research universities on the right. And what this really highlights is that while everybody faces challenges with making sure that they create a balance between the footprint of space that they have and the enrollment and enrollment trends that they have, that there are different groupings of institutions at different points in their life cycle here. As we look at baccalaureate and masters, they are facing much more immediate challenges in terms of addressing the needs of their space and changing their relationship with space to bring it more into balance with their current position. At the same time, I think it's just as important that research universities, which are not currently out of balance from an enrollment versus space growth standpoint, to begin to and continue to make prudent decisions about how they allocate their resources so that they don't find themselves in a much more challenging position 3 to 5 years from now. So it's usually at this point in the presentation where I start to get depressed and, we've gotten through all the bad news. So the final question, the final thing I'd like to cover on is, what is there ultimately to do? And specifically, what is there to do in the context of the response that every institution is going to have to make around COVID? So ultimately, on the last slide, you are all going to be facing immediate decisions in response to COVID. You already are. There are things that you're having to do to prepare campus to come back online. We're going to hear about some of those today. To manage your campus, to manage your staff, to manage your facilities. This is going to range from how do you reorganize your space to accommodate for social distancing, what are the new cleaning standards and how do you abide by them. Most are going to have to think about how to absorb likely fairly deep budget and capital reductions. These decisions and these situations are going to be extraordinarily difficult. In many cases, these decisions are likely going to push your facilities organization in an undesirable direction for you. It's going to force you to do things that you otherwise would not do. But by establishing a framework today that creates balance with those decisions between the immediate action of now and longer-term considerations for where you're going as an institution, it will increase the likelihood that in the future, you're not spending years undoing the damage done by urgent decisions made in the heat of the moment. So to whatever extent possible, thinking about how do the decisions that I'm being required to make around the response to COVID, how do they fit into the long-term strategy of my institution? How do they fit into the long-term viability of my institution? Additionally, I think I've had many conversations with facilities leaders. There are many things that have never been able to be on the table, that have been politically unpalatable. Now is the time to bring those back up. These might include reduction of space, reducing your campus footprint, identifying spaces that are no longer core assets to your campus. This might include reevaluating classroom scheduling standards with a focus to improve utilization. Here we're talking about having classes on Friday afternoon or having classes at 8:30, especially if we have to put half as many students in each classroom. And finally, thinking about space ownership policies and how much space each department and each individual and each person needs to fully do their job. Finally, I think the last point is for the average university, if it is to be successful in the next decade, will likely look smaller and more focused to be able to compete for students and at the same time remain financially viable. What this means is that every institution is really going to be challenged to identify what it is that differentiates your institution from its competitors and focus your finite facility resources and your finite facilities attention on the spaces that support that differentiation. So in closing, ultimately, to emerge better off from the current environment, it's going to require facilities leaders to challenge their institutional leaders to confront these structural issues that I highlighted head on, and in many cases acting boldly to make decisions that don't just address the immediate need of today, but also do so in alignment with the needs of tomorrow for the institution. So with that, I will hand it back to Lander.
Yes, thank you so much, Peter. That was really excellent. I think you've given us so many things to consider to establish a framework to balance those short-term needs with long-term strategies, ultimately to position yourself to raise tough questions that you need to raise now with senior leadership. Really great questions for institutions to Tabletop. I'd also recommend there's a Jeffrey Moore decision-making model called CORE. It's around core and context, and it aligns beautifully with the discussion that Peter just provided that APA has actually used to prepare its own strategic planning. So I would like now to go to Mark Miller. He's the Assistant Vice President, Facilities Management and Planning at the Pennsylvania State University. Mark joined Penn State in June of 2019, covering all aspects of the Office of Physical Plant and Stewardship of Penn State's physical plant assets. Mark was previously employed at the University of Nebraska, was the first Associate Vice President for Facilities Management in the University of Nebraska system. Mark also served 24 years as both an Air Force Civil Engineer Office in the Air Force Civil Engineer Office and Air Force Civilian, and was awarded various service and campaign medals. Mark is a registered professional engineer and holds a bachelor's degree in civil and architectural engineering from the University of Wyoming and a master's degree in engineering management from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and graduate of the U.S. Air Force Squadron Officers School and Air Command and Staff College. Mark will provide a sense of where they are and how he is addressing the waves of construction, deferred renewal, capital plan investments, and strategic philosophy, how he is addressing suitability of space, economic viability, pedagogical configurations, evaluation and quantification, what it means in terms of prioritization of capital projects, and an associated equation, along with a few recommended strategies to assist his colleagues. Mark's discussion will be very helpful for your use as tabletop suggestions as well. Mark? Mark, you're muted, I think.
Thanks for the introduction. I appreciate that. And Peter, thanks for the great lead into my presentation.
Yeah.
Better? Okay, thanks. Thanks, Lander.
Make sure we can hear you.
Appreciate the introduction. And
That's
Peter,
now,
thanks for the great lead into my presentation today. I'm going to touch on a couple things this afternoon. The first thing is to take the data that's produced from sightlines and show how this is being used to help to direct the formation and the development of the 5-year capital plan here at Penn State. Second, I want to transition over to basically what our space looks like and the impacts that COVID-19 epidemic is having for how we might employ our facility space assets, so to say, and both the short and the long term. So moving on to the first slide. If we could go to the first slide that shows the age of construction at Penn State, that would be great.
Mark, we can't hear you.
Sorry, Lander. Everything is shown down on my end. Any better?
Yes, now it is.
Now, if we could go to the second slide. Okay, very good. Moving on to the second slide, this shows the age of construction here at Penn State. As you can see, the age of our facilities, for the most part, really closely parallels the Sightlines age of construction database, with the age of construction database for Sightlines being in the blue and Penn State being shown in the red. You can really see the close parallel here. Well, what's that really mean? It means that a number of our facilities that were built during the campus construction boom during the 60s and through the 70s are reaching the age of their useful life, both from an MEP systems perspective and then also in taking a look at the facilities envelope. So if we're to maintain the campus, this bow wave of aging facilities really needs to be addressed and accounted for in our capital plans and our operating budgets. If we move on to slide 3, this slide shows and provides an overview of what's required at Penn State, not only to catch up, but also to keep up with the current deferral renewal program. So what do I mean by catch up? Catch up is our annual investment required to address the current deferral renewal. And the keep up, this will target those facilities that are reaching the end of their useful life over the next 10 years, while also accounting for inflation. So you can see here what the profile for funding would be for the deferral renewal from 2018 up through 2028. Moving to slide 4. Slide 4 provides a really good overview of Penn State's capital expenditures over the almost last 20 years. As you can see, early in the 2000s, there was a big emphasis on capital project versus renewal of the current space and the current infrastructure. Later in the 2000s, in the 2011 through 2013 timeframe, you started to see that emphasis switch, moving over to much more of an emphasis on existing space and renewal of that space versus the continuation or the building of new space. Moving forward with the new capital plan, 2018 through 2023, we'll see a big emphasis in that also in the renewal portion. I expect that to continue with the capital plan that we're just starting to take a look at that will be 2023 on and 5 years. Slide 5 will start to show how the current capital plan is organized, the 2018 through the 2023 capital plan. This slide shows that 67% of our current capital plan is dedicated to catch up and keep up. So basically 67% going to the keep up, addressing the bow wave in front of us of those facilities from the 60s and 70s that are reaching the end of their useful life, and the catch up, 33% of that, addressing our current deferred maintenance. Also, the breakdown of 25 to 75%, the ratio showing our whole systems or new facilities versus the whole systems renewal. And this is spread out over both the University Park and the Commonwealth campuses. We have not only University Park, but 23 Commonwealth campuses. And the breakdown largely aligns with that footprint, with 75% going to University Park and 25% going to the Commonwealth campuses. As we transition moving forward, what's this really mean in the future with COVID? And how are we taking a look at our capital plan? And what can our capital plan do to help us? On slide 6, you can start to see what we're taking a look at with planning purposes. I'm co-chairing the capital planning work group where we're taking a look at 2 different things as we move forward. One of those things is our capital plan, and how do we align the capital plan investment in each project with the overall funding available? How do we basically rack and stack those projects? And what we would really like to do is start to take a look at different components that can come forward and evaluate those projects and have an equation that we can present both to the trustees and to senior leadership to say how these projects were racked and stacked and prioritized. The second thing we'll take a look at is how we incorporate the sustainability component as we move forward in the suitability component. A lot of times on our campus, we have the space available, but is that the right space? And is that the right space that we want to be taking a look at for facility renewal? So 2 equations or 2 things that need to be included in this overall equation is the space right? Does it fit? And also, is there a resiliency component? What's shown right here is the initial work that we did with the sightlines and Gordian group to take a look at what could that equation look like and what would be some of those components that we would take a look at and part of the equation. Well, what we really need to take a look at and add to this is space right? Is it suitable for what we want going forward and for the uses that are being contemplated? Also, what's the resiliency component? How do we account for resiliency moving forward? Because as we move forward with this pandemic or with any other thing in the future, we can't automatically be shutting down campus. That can't be our response. So we need to have some sort of resiliency component built into our capital plan moving forward. If we take a look at some of the recent publications, just this morning there was a recent FEMA article that concerned the planning and the considerations for organizations and reconstituting during the pandemic. This article noted that incorporation of social distancing measures, including limiting budget building capacities, staggering shifts, closing common areas, and rotating office days for shared offices, and installing physical barriers are something we're going to need to take a look at. I also saw a good quote this morning that college is not going away. All consuming traumatic episodes do not necessarily move society backwards. They force adaptation and innovation. So as facility leaders, I think it's important that we start to include not only a suitability component into our decision-making process, but also resiliency. As we move into slide 7, you can see that this list certainly is not inclusive, but here are just a few things that we need to think through as we start to consider the short-term use of space and what we use from a space standpoint. Signage and walkway decals are something we could take a look at, reminding people of social distancing. Door openers that allow for restrooms to be opened with your feet rather than being touched upon exiting after washing your hands are one thing to take a look at. Clear partitions in our unions and administrative facilities, and also impact of social distancing in our classrooms. Social distancing in the classrooms is a really interesting topic. Well, I'd like to be really clear that social distancing in the classrooms is something that's currently not being considered at Penn State. Social distancing has, of course, been a topic of discussion at the national level, but looking at the return to larger gathering events such as athletics, theaters, any educational classroom setting, whether that's K through 12 or higher education. So social distancing in the classroom setting is also part of the discussion yesterday during the Big Ten Facility Directors Teleconference. Some very interesting data was being shared there and provided for the impacts on what social distancing could mean for scheduling. To get a quick feel for what this would mean if we would go to a 6-foot social distancing requirement in the classroom, I asked Planning, Design, and Properties here at Penn State to take a quick look at what the impacts would be in a typical classroom setting. So just want to give a quick shout out to Steve Watson and his folks there, and Tom Case, for pulling this information together for us real quick. As you can see, the impacts of 6-foot social distancing would be dramatic on typical classrooms. If we just take a look at a couple of our classrooms, for instance, a 36-seat classroom, you would end up with approximately 38% of the seats available. Or if you move to a larger classroom, such as a 234-seat classroom, you would only have about 21% of those seats available for use. So the impact wouldn't just be limited to classroom. This would also be extended to lab sections for the STEM community. So what changes or adaptations does this then drive to provide on-campus classes while maintaining social 6-foot distancing? Would that force the classes to go to an extended Monday through Friday class period? How about the extension of classes and labs into the weekends? Or maybe the use of auditoriums, gymnasiums, and conference room spaces on the campus to accommodate the additional class sections? Or would we take a look at a hybrid type of class with both a hybrid and an online component of the class being offered to reduce the campus densities? Moving on to the last slide. Again, while this list is not all inclusive, here's a couple things to consider that campus facilities and organizations may take a look at in the future. One big thing is demo. There's always opportunities, and we just need to take a look, and we need to find those during this COVID-19 shutdown and what this provides for us in the future. Again, while the list is not all inclusive, demo is one thing that I think we really need to start to take a look at. While it's not always a popular subject on the campus for a number of reasons, and one of those reasons is a lot of times the senior leadership report card to a certain extent is a reflection of how the campuses grew under their leadership. However, it's now the time to start to have those discussions. And while they're hard, will the budget pressures and the facility suitability moving forward allow us to start to have those discussions, where we start to take a look at taking current inventory and old inventory offline. And what about space? Is that now suitable for our current operating environment? There's a number of other benefits to the demo discussion. Remember, demolition is always one of the tools that we have available to us when we take a look at increasing our facility condition indexes, as well as taking offline all the old expensive and facilities that we have problems with maintaining and operating those from a energy use standpoint. One thing that I find really interesting also in the discussion concerning classroom design and space allocation is, do we now increase the square footage per student allowance in new classroom design moving forward to allow for social distancing? And what about movement to more open and collaborative office spaces? Is that something that we move away from now for both faculty and staff to allow us natural means for the social distancing? So these are just some of the things that we're taking a look at here at Penn State, and it's part of the larger discussion that occurred yesterday with the Big Ten facility directors. So I look forward to the questions, and Lander, with that, and turn it back over to you.
That's excellent, Mark. on your last slide of how you're viewing it long term and some of the questions that you're asking, and then associated with the wonderful slide on classroom, what that means in terms of social distancing is beginning to answer a particular question that someone asked, and it's also identifying the forcing of different schedule changes, which will be very interesting. And I think our next presenter will be addressing some of these things as well. Tom Polanski, Associate Vice President for Facilities, Occidental College. Tom has served Occidental College for the past 7 years. Tom started his professional career as a project manager with UCLA Capital Programs and as the small and community colleges representatives for PC-APA, one of APA's 6 regions on the West Coast. In his spare time, Tom enjoys rowing and playing in the backyard with his 2 obedient children and his intelligent Labrador Retriever. I find those descriptions interesting in the times of COVID. So Tom will speak to the state of play in terms of the stages of pandemic response, the impact on traditional space configurations, and what that starts to look like, how they are reorienting time and labor, being change ready and preparing for the next wave that will certainly prompt good tabletop exercises moving forward. Tom, looking forward to your comments.
Thank you, Lander.
Make sure you're not muted.
Honored and blessed to be here with you all in these crazy times. Can you hear me now? Can you all hear me?
And
can you hear me?
yes, very good.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Lander. Glad to be here. Okay.
Yes, we can.
So after some brief background information to set the stage we find ourselves in. Okay. Can you hear me now? All right. So after I set the stage, I'll get very specific with some very actionable examples that y'all may be able to apply at your campus. Okay, next slide. Next slide. Great, thank you. So here we are. We're at the end of stage 1. We've been hit in the mouth. We now need to pivot to planning. After a little bit more on that, we'll talk about reorienting the resources we have, which include space, time, and your labor. And then I'll close with some stay ready comments. Next slide. Next slide. So as everyone's seen on the news every darn morning and every night, we're right about here in this pandemic based on where you are in the country. Next slide. Next slide. So we're right at the end of stage 1. States and local authorities are starting to loosen restrictions a little bit in stage 2. We'll establish our protection, and then we'll plan for some next waves by stage 4. Next slide. We're going to go from this is us just a few months ago. Next slide. To this. So we're in this virtual, strange world of running a very physically intense type of operation. Very strange for most of us. Next slide. This is my favorite scene from the movie Apollo 13. You got the engineers with their short sleeve shirts and ties. We've got to make the square thing fit into a hole for this round thing, the guy says, using only what's on the table. Your campus is no different from this scene. Your campus is a space capsule with limited access to new resources. So what can you do with what you've got? Next slide. First resource you have is space. So we have to think about how we're going to reutilize our existing space. Like Mark mentioned, we have to think about population density, workspace layout and workflow, repurposing existing spaces, possibly installing plexiglass screens, reducing the amount of things we need to touch at all times. Next slide. I'm now going to show some floor plans of kind of a generic office space, and I'll go through these pretty quickly, I promise. So this is how things were pre-pandemic. You've got typical conference rooms, offices, restrooms, reception area. Next slide. You'll see in this version there is quite a bit of distance and a reduction in occupancy. This could be the biggest thing we have to deal with. You see fewer people per space. You see the furniture being changed. This is not the time to be building new space, at least on the small campuses. This is really reorienting what you've got. You can see here the plan with the plexiglass screens, and further breaking up the space into smaller and smaller increments. Next slide. Next slide. This is a diagram that kind of gets into the industrial hygiene aspects of this whole situation. You've got a cold zone where you have your folks inside an office, a transition zone, which is between the semi-safe zone and the outside hot zone, where folks are quite likely to be infected. So how do you deal with that transition zone to the hot zone when you have contact with the public, with students, with contractors, with faculty? Let me show you our answer to this. Next slide. I don't believe Amazon needs to worry about any competition for Amazon lockers. This is the Oxy locker solution. This is a regular old 4-door filing cabinet. I warned you all that I'd get pretty specific fast. Next slide. So each of the drawers is numbered 1 through 4. This is where we hand out contractor packets. We're currently hosting medical staff from 2 different local hospitals in our empty res halls. So this is where folks can check in and check out with their card keys. You see the drawers are numbered. This is about as low tech as it gets, folks, but these are the kinds of things we have to start thinking about. Next slide. Quick shout out to Mario Bonilla, our incredible cleaning services manager, who went through all of our classrooms last week and reoriented them from this, which is a 25-person classroom. Next slide. Considering the 6-foot social distancing rules, we're down to 11 seats in the same classroom. This is radically different for our campus, and I'm sure it will hit you all just as hard. Next slide. This is another example, but with the typical tabletops, shared tabletops. Next slide. This one went from 25 to 11 seats. Quite a bit of difference. Next slide. This is one of our larger auditorium rooms. We went from 200 down to 30 seats. X marks where students can sit with 6 feet of distance. So this is just the physical aspects of this. Next slide. We're going to all have to get really creative with the type of spaces we're going to use. These are spaces we don't typically use for classroom areas. We have many outdoor areas. We're blessed in Southern California with great weather, so we may need to purchase or rent tents for some of these areas. AV is not set up in these areas yet, but could be. We're all going to have to get very creative, and the folks we work with especially faculty, will need to be quite flexible. Next slide. We'll have to think about directional signage and other human factors. I'm sure everyone's seen stores now that have these kinds of things. Next slide. So beyond space, the other thing we have control over is time. So we have to reorient how we're using our time, including staggered work shifts to reduce crowding at the time clocks, for example. Smaller teams doing more discrete projects, reduce overlap at break times and lunches. And then the schedule stretch. So this has to do, you'll immediately find out how good the relationship is with your registrar, your dean of the college, when you start talking about needing more class sessions per day, or per week, per month, to be able to handle the reduced occupancy of those classrooms. The academic calendar may need to shift. We may need to go beyond what Lander calls the agrarian model. Next resource you have is labor. So using staff for projects, redeploy staff for your new priorities. We have ground staff doing custodial sometimes now. We have a painting crew made out of multiple areas. So how are you going to do all this? It's not going to be easy. This will test the strength of every relationship you have on campus with your colleagues, which brings up our favorite topic in APA. Next slide. Change management. So with your values in mind, you will need to, next slide, you will need to communicate again and again in many different ways. You have to deal with the emotional impacts of this. We can't just go into robot mode and just move furniture around. You have to think about who you're talking to at all times, which means you have to speak the language of your audience, from the CFO to the academic side to your bargaining unit to the administration. This is when you can cash in on all those relationships you've been building up over the years, and always consider what your campus partner considers a win and a loss. Next slide. So finally, we have to stay ready for the next wave of this thing. There could be multiple waves. Look back on the initial response. What did you do right? What could you do better? Update any business continuity and pandemic response plans based on your learning. Restock your supplies as available. Continually monitor your situation. Call your staff. Get people talking, whether it's virtual. More communication is always better. So just to close, more than any other department on your campuses, as facilities professionals, we have the tools, leadership, experience, and the heart and grit to get through this with grace and our core values intact. Thank you for your time, and I hope this was useful.
Tom, this was super useful. I really like that you laid out different styles. That's starting to answer some questions that we are already getting from folks on the line. This need for creativity and flexibility, particularly toward at the end when you talked about the relationships, it's definitely going to test the strength of every relationship. And you gave us some tips and pointers for making sure that we do that well. So our next panelist, our final panelist, is MR Chip Kevin. He is the Chief Facilities Management and General Services Officer, University of Maine System. Chip has led an administrative restructuring of facilities management and strategic procurement for the University of Maine System that combined independent campus-based operations into unified administrative units with the capacity and expertise to support strategic objectives and responsibly steward public resources, saving millions for reinvestment in the university's mission, securing the largest public investment in campus capital infrastructure in the system's history. Chip is also the incident commander of the university's statewide COVID-19 response and co-chair of its Safe Return Planning Committee. Chip is an alumnus of the then Washington County Technical College and Colby College. So you have a sense of place. The University of Maine System is a comprehensive public institution of higher education that unites 6 distinctive public universities comprising 10 campuses and numerous centers across 9 million gross square feet of facility space. Chip will address the space challenge and how he is and actually has been tackling space, clarity of focus on investing in existing space, and the benefits derived before COVID-19 hit, to provide a series of thought-provoking questions that will drive excellent tabletop exercises for all of you. Chip has quite a story to tell. Let's listen. Chip?
Lander, thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation to be with you today. Thanks to my fellow panelists for the great presentations. And I want to take just a moment to send my best thoughts to everybody who is with us today, not only for joining us, but I imagine that all of us have been at least indirectly impacted by COVID-19. And for those of you in particular who may have been directly impacted in one way or another in your professional or perhaps in your personal lives, our best thoughts go out to you as we all work together to try to get through this. With that, I'll turn to the presentation. And if we could go to slide 2. So the challenge at the University of Maine system does predate COVID-19, and my remarks today will focus on how we think COVID-19 will influence that and how we have been trying to address some of the challenges that you've heard about today so far. This chart shows the renovation age, the effective renovation age of our facilities, something we use as a stand-in, as many of you may do as well, for condition assessment. It's more readily understandable by our audience many times. And the challenging message of this slide is that our space at the University of Maine system is old, it's older than our peers, and it's getting older quickly. So this year, we crossed the 50% threshold of the total space that we have having an effective renovation age of more than 50 years old. I think all of you are aware of the challenges that come with old space. So we've been trying to tackle this for some time. So can we go to the next slide, please? So on the next slide, what have we been doing to try to tackle this? So as Lander mentioned, we did undertake a bit of a top to bottom review in the early part of the 2010s to try to get on top of this. We did see the problem coming, and with the support of our trustees, we have managed to do a number of things. So I'm going to just cover a couple of those. Establishing measurable goals for the condition of our facilities and other metrics, making sure that we had transparency of data for everything from reporting on facilities metrics to actually guiding investments and divvying up the resources that we were fortunate to get during this time period, using data to try to make those decisions as objectively as possible. Our board of trustees actually agreed to adopt a policy and charge us with changes in practices to preclude any net increases in space or facility costs without the trustees' direct participation, which their support has made a huge difference in our ability to hold the line on increases in space and actually to start to begin to reduce space, as you'll see in a minute. Also adopted for the first time a comprehensive budgeting process that looks at both long-term and short-term capital plans that aren't siloed in the facilities management shop, but which actually marry up to our budgeting process. So our one-year capital plans actually are part of the budget process, and our longer-term capital plans are actually part of the longer-term budget process. They work in sync together, not in their individual silos. And we also include our capital budgets as a distinct part of the budget presentation and something which the trustees consider and vote on specifically, so that if the investments are not all that we would want them to be, as they often are not, that is not a surprise to our leadership when the metrics don't get better as fast as we would like them to, or don't get better at all. Everybody knows going into the budget whether we've invested enough money or not. There's been a variety of other things that we've done, but that's some of what we've done to try to tackle space. Next slide, please. This next slide is one of my regular slides when I talk to folks about this. I'll just summarize very quickly that on the far left, you can see that roughly 50-50 division of the blue and the gray sections of the chart. That's showing that back in the FY06 to FY12 time period, about half of our investment in the University of Maine system was in new space. If you look at the succeeding graphs in the middle and on the far right, you can see that we've turned the tables on that, and we now invest only about 15% of our available resources into new space, and most of that money in new space is actually renovation through renewal, not actually net increases in space, but new construction to replace old construction that we are taking down or otherwise divesting of. Next slide, please. What has that meant? We have been starting to see some results of all of this. So this is a chart showing one view of decline in our space over the period of time covered in the graph. You can see that by these metrics, we've declined in the amount of gross square footage we have by about 250,000 square feet of space. That number changes a little bit depending on exactly how you look at it, but it's a good, reliable, and defensible number. We are hoping to reduce our space by approximately 5% of what we started with in the relatively near term. That would be about 400,000, perhaps getting to 500,000 gross square feet of space, and we are on track to accomplish that. So trying to do a lot of the things that you've heard about in earlier presentations today, get ahead of those fixed costs and reduce the amount of space that we have to take care of within reasonable bounds. We recognize certainly the need for space, but also wanted to make sure that we're not burdening our own business operations with the cost of space that we don't need. Next slide, please. So this next slide shows another metric by which we measure some of our success. So you can see here that it's not a really dramatic change, but you can see that there was generally a downward trend in those blue bars and that has risen and stabilized a little bit. This measures the density of use on our campus, the number of people we have for the amount of square footage that we have. That number was going in the wrong direction for a long time. We have managed to turn that around by both constraining space and stabilizing and increasing our enrollments a little bit. So you can see that has bounced back a little bit. It's still not where we want it to be in the long term, but we have met an interim measurable goal that we set for trying to get to a specific number of users per amount of space that we had. We have a long way to go to get to our long-term goal, but we're pleased that we've managed to achieve an intermediate milestone, if you will, and we're hopeful for more success along that in the future. Next slide, please. So now comes COVID-19. And what does that do to a university like ours, or perhaps to your university as well? You've heard a lot of comparisons like this, but for my part, the one I like to think about is that on March 1st, of the 10,000 courses that the University of Maine system offers across our state, through our outstanding faculty, approximately 6,500 of those courses were offered in person. That is no longer the case. And it happened virtually overnight. Here in the state of Maine, as I suspect is true for many of you, we are 100% virtual. We have almost nothing happening on our campus. Some very, very limited activity to take care of our facilities, but not much more than that. So COVID-19 raises lots of questions for us. What are the implications for the amount and the kind of space we're going to need going forward? Is it going to be the same size, the same style, the same type? Technology questions in particular. Are we going to face increased expectations by faculty or students, or maybe from both populations, for increased flexibility for courses to be taught in multiple modalities and have that be no big deal, that courses may be so-called hybrid courses may become the norm, or courses may flip back and forth with regularity depending on the needs of the professor or the needs of the student? Will that quality of place that is something that we think about in facilities management continue to have the same kind of importance as it has in the past as a defining characteristic of the higher education experience. I think we all believe that the sense of place on our campuses and the quality of place has been a meaningful thing to our communities. Is that going to be the same going forward? I don't know what the future holds on that point, but I have to believe that it's going to be different. What are the implications for technology investments within our vertical infrastructure or in place of vertical and horizontal infrastructure? And certainly we incorporate technology today, as all of you do, but will this in some way shift the balance of where capital resources flow in terms of more technology investment and less brick and mortar investment? And we've talked a lot about court classes today, but one of the things we're spending a lot of time thinking about here as well is of the workforce. Is this situation going to change the dynamic of where people, both faculty and staff, want to be, to do their work and to do their learning? So are we going to be facing a changed environment, not only for classrooms, but for workspace? And are folks going to be working remotely more by choice and by mutual agreement rather than by necessity? And what does that do to our footprint for office space and so forth? Next slide, please. So we at the University of Maine system are confronting many of the same short-term challenges all of you are with their reconfiguration of our existing space. But I want to take a minute just to cover that broader topic of what this is all going to mean to us for the 5, 10, 20-year time horizon, rather than only exclusively at least the next 6 to 9 months, and what we're all going to be scrambling to do in the fall to be open successfully to the best of our collective abilities for our students, staff, and faculty.
Chip? Chip, we lost you right at the end.
I apologize. I was just concluding to say that I appreciate the invitation again today, and I'll look forward to the questions.
That's excellent, Chip. I really appreciate it. I think it gave this this view of space needs, space requirements, and reinvesting in existing and actually reductions. You have made some very bold moves and done a great job with it, and you've helped everyone on the call thereafter think about the kinds of questions they need to in order to continue to sort this out. So let's go to some Q&A. We still have some time for that. And our actually, with the kinds of questions that were asked, we really do have many answers. So throughout the presentation. So let me ask Tom, where you are reducing seating, do you see removing seats, placing them in storage, leaving them in the room, that sort of thing? Marking them as you had noticed. Mark, I'll come to you for that as well with 200 plus seat classrooms. But are you also scheduling time between classes for cleaning throughout the day? So it's getting to the larger issues around the perception of cleaning. Tom?
Great. That's a great question, because perception is reality, especially in these days of, do I send my child back to college or not in the fall? For the fixed auditoriums, we're just going to mark the seats. If it's a movable furniture type of room, we may redeploy that furniture to the new areas, like the new outdoor areas, or rooms that we've never really used as classrooms before. We're going to be deploying hand sanitizers at the entrance to each classroom. We haven't discussed yet the frequency of cleaning of the classrooms, though, but that's something we should definitely look at.
Very good. Mark?
Lander, for us, again, this isn't something that has been discussed, but we're just taking a look at what that possibility could be. And you can see that in a large classroom setting, we wouldn't be able to remove those seats, but we would have to find ways to mark what seats would be available to be sat in and so forth. And again, what Tom said, to reflect that impact on the custodial staff would be tremendous if we increase the both the time frame for the classes and the time during the day that you would have classes on into the potentially the weekends. You can just see that our cleaning frequency and the demand of the custodial staff would really increase exponentially as we start to move forward with that. So that's just one of the questions that needs to be answered, and one of the things that we need to discuss as we move forward as to what does that look like, and then what does that do to your utility budgets moving forward when you are counting on having the a classroom or a building start to come offline pretty much by 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. What happens now when that building is running from 7 a.m. until 10 o'clock p.m. or later, and then on the weekends? So a number of things to be considered from a facility perspective when we start to take a look at what would this really mean.
Very good. And I think there are also questions coming about halls, corridors, common spaces, building entrances, the circulation you're seeing at many stores with respect to social distancing. Mark, you want to tackle, and then I'd like to hear about that impact at Maine, Chip. So Mark?
Yeah, Lander, I think there's a couple things. I think there's both the near term and the long term that we need to think about with that. Near term would be some of the things that you see, like you said, in the grocery stores. Some of the hand sanitizer stands, some of the wipes that could be available for people coming in and out of the facility. I think long term we need to take a look at what does that mean for our circulation paths on campus, as well as what does that mean for our entryways into the facilities? Do we start to move towards more of a storefront type operation where it's largely motion activated that opens up, so we don't have those touches and we can get away from the cleaning of that so much? Same thing with the cleaning of the common spaces. What does that take, and what's going to be required there? Do you go to an opportunity or go to more of a standard where there's some responsibilities of the folks in those facilities to do some of the cleaning, meaning with the wipes and so forth, to wipe down door handles and stuff like that once they're done going through or prior to going through?
Very good. And Chip, can you chime in on that? It's going to have an impact on your existing space and what you're trying to do to get those reductions.
Yes, I would say that we're doing many of the similar things that everybody else has mentioned for the near term. The one additional note I might make is we're also thinking about beyond the need for facilities, or how we make the most use of the facilities, is are there going to be other technology solutions that allow us to not use the facilities? So really thinking about that remote learning continuing potentially in some ways as one of the tools, maybe one of the demands that our population makes that may have some pretty dramatic influences on what we need to do with the traditional learning spaces.
That's excellent. So Peter, can you possibly speak to metrics that folks should be using to measure their renewal needs? You were looking at some of those, and then Mark, you talked a bit about this, so maybe you could follow on to Peter. Peter, you want to take a stab?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the things, especially as we're thinking about retrofitting and making some significant changes to facilities just to occupy them, I think one of the things to look at is what is going to be the in addition to short-term modernization type or COVID specific investments you have to make, what are the long-term investments that would go along with that? And the reason to do that is that, if you make those changes, that's dollars that, if that building isn't ultimately going to be a long-term asset, you may then need to, those dollars were wasted and could have been used elsewhere. So I think combining a decision around what to do in the short term with, does this program need to have a physical presence if we have to implement some of these very significant and costly changes? So it's maybe kind of tying those two together.
Very good, very good. Mark?
Yeah, Lander, I think we take a look at that. I think we really need to be careful when we start to move forward in the future and start to take a look at our design guidelines and what do we do there. Is the right thing to automatically increase the square footage per student in the classroom space, for instance, by 60% or more to allow the social distancing the right answer? Financially, I don't think that's going to be feasible for anybody. But the solution may be to take a look at what are some surge spaces that could be used. For instance, auditoriums, conference rooms, and some spaces like that, gymnasiums, that could be used to allow us to go back to more of a social distancing, to give us some surge capability for classroom space required, but also not make this footprint so physically large again that we just create another bow wave of issues for us to address 10, 20 years in the future.
That's excellent. And you talked about resiliency and suitability. How are you scoring or ranking that? And then maybe, Peter, you can follow him. Mark?
We're just starting that discussion now, Lander. And the suitability is, again, just because you may have the space, it doesn't mean that it's the right space. Now, it could be space, for instance, it could be an old a dry lab. Well, that's not suitable for a wet lab moving forward, but it could be suitable for administrative space. So some of those considerations need to be taken into account. And then also the resiliency. I think there has to be a component in your overall equation to take a look at resiliency. And is this investment in the facility or in a new facility going to provide that resiliency? And what factors can you include, or what design elements can you include to have that resiliency? Some facilities you may be able to, and some you wouldn't. So that would be a relative measure of that.
Good. Peter, you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. Yeah. One thing just to add to the suitability comment is one really kind of good where the rubber hits the road way to look at that is to actually do an assessment of the way in which your classrooms are utilized. And what you'll find is that the lowest utilized classrooms are usually that for a reason. And so that can start to identify what you might have as some structural or widespread suitability issues, particularly around space utilization, that then can become targets or even potentially spaces to utilize differently or get rid of ultimately. And so I think suitability is a twofold. You can either eliminate it or you can make some investments, as Mark was talking about, to bring it up to a higher level that maybe meets the needs of your current programs.
That's excellent. So we had a question about, and it says considering cost and revenue and the issues around that, the work involved in reconfiguring spaces. A valid question, is it even worse doing the traditional in-classroom instruction, or do instructions continue with online? Chip, you were targeting some of that in your last slide on questions. You want to take a stab?
Sorry, Lander, this is Chip. I think that was directed at me initially, so I'll try that. So in terms of investment for the near term, we would not, in my view, we would not be looking to be making lots of investments to make rapid changes to accommodate social distancing. We'd be looking to do that through operational means. So for example, having students potentially sit and adhere to the 6-foot distancing requirements, but not doing things like removing seats or actually reconfiguring spaces and so forth. I think the situation is just changing so quickly that kind of investment would be premature. So that's the way we're handling it at the moment at the University of Maine system, but certainly echo the comments that some others have made about some similar actions.
That's excellent. Okay, so we have a number of questions, and I want to make sure folks recognize that we had a town hall just a couple times ago on residential facilities, and it was really speaking to some of the social distancing that they are trying to plan for, so I recommend you go to that one. We will also seek answers to the questions you have about the restrictions and the impacts that are going to occur with respect to residence halls. So I think they'll get answered there. All slides will be provided. Obviously, the recording will also be shared. I do want to ask, or at least recount that one other question about UV and HVAC systems have been addressed in our RAQs. Recently asked questions so that you can find it there too. So I think we've handled all of those questions. Now I'm looking to see, it said, is Penn State, is there a formula the universities are using for social distancing capacities? Are you even at that place? And if, maybe I'd have Tom and then Mark and Chip and follow that with Peter, and then we'll go to a close.
Yeah, similar to, this is Tom, similar to what Mark said, we're looking at about 30% of our previous capacity after we do the test fit with the 6-foot distance between chairs.
Excellent. Mark or Chip?
Yeah, Landry, it's Mark. Currently, we're just starting to get back into that. We have a number of committees that are taking a look at return to work, return to campus, return to education in the online setting versus the on-campus setting. So very, very early in the game for where we're at with that. So a number of things being considered. As everybody said, the information is almost changing on a daily basis. And you feel that if you sit in one meeting in the morning, the information is changed by the afternoon. So I think flexibility and creativity moving forward is going to be critical with this as we start to evaluate what options we have.
Excellent. If you want to hit that, and then I'll ask Peter, and we'll round it out, and I'll go to close.
Yeah, shout out for the facilities directors on each of our campuses. They are doing that work. Frankly, most of my focus is on the question of whether we can be open and how we can be open. And our facilities directors are doing the hard work of trying to figure out what that all means, whether it's 30% or some other number, whether we're using additional facilities that we don't traditionally use for education, whether we're doing all the scheduling things that folks have talked about. So that work is happening. It tends to happen in our campus emergency response teams rather than more broadly when it comes to that kind of implementation detail.
Excellent. Peter, you want to round it out, and then we'll close this up.
Yeah, I think one thing, not knowing what I could say, I mean, 30% sounds like a good benchmark, but one of the things that probably is an important consideration is it's not just about how many seats were in the classroom and how many seats are now in the classroom, but it's also about considering how many seats that were in the classroom before were actually full, because it's often the case that there's a mismatch between the size of classroom and the enrolled course amount. And so you already have a lot of empty seats. So that 30% impact may in some cases be less than that. And so that's an important consideration as well, to truly gauge the full impact of that kind of social distancing practice.
Excellent. All of you have done a fantastic job. We got a slew of questions at the end, and some of them did relate to a couple of our town halls prior. We will get you pointers and links to those, and we will answer them, some on the HVAC, some on the student residential facilities. A number of those questions we have been addressing, but we will get more specifics to you as a result of this town hall. I want to congratulate our panel on this was 4 panelists, a very tough job of really complementing one another and giving you an incredible amount of resources. They will all be available on our site. All the Q&As will be available on our site, and recordings and slides. So all of that will be coming to you. We will also be asking them to address some of the specific questions that you had asked for each person if we did not get them. So thank you, panel, very much. I want to remind everyone the space survey will remain open until Monday, May 4. It's addressing all 3 pre, during, and post-COVID space related issues and your strategic planning efforts. So we were really looking forward to you to complete that, update the infographic, prepare a cogent summary. We will lay out your detailed responses and post it to the APA website under COVID-19 related surveys and responses. We'll let you know when that's available. There's also continuous learning certificates. We are getting a lot of people that want certificates, and Billy is turning those around in 2 to 3 days, which is unbelievable. So we really appreciate your desire to get your continuous learning through APA, and we will continue to ramp that up. We are always asking a call for images on COVID-19 related pictures that we can share with colleagues on the APA website. We do have a resource slide that shows all of the COVID-19 resources and beyond, frankly. We do have a save the date and next week's topic. It is if, then, and what scenarios. These are the kinds of things that all of you are starting to do that you should be doing right now as you ramp up for summer and into fall and thereafter. And that's the kind of thing that I think you will all be very interested in hearing our panelists on that topic next Friday. In closing, Yogi Berra once said, "The future ain't what it used to be." Nope, it's not. The coronavirus is a world-changing event. The silver linings are thin compared with the scale of the coronavirus catastrophe. Yet silver linings are important. They bring out optimism. Churchill said that the pessimist sees difficulty in every opportunity. The optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty. Taken a step further, the early 20th century British explorer Ernest Shackleton once noted, "Optimism is true moral courage." So I take you back to Churchill. Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. So optimism and courage, these qualities are needed more than ever as we make decisions that will shape our lives and the next normal. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see many of you next week. Bye.